In the second part of the parameter section, we're going to cover the joint parameters. There are two quadrants for joint parameters. The first one controls the joint parameters for the in joint. The second one right here controls the joint parameters for the out joint. Once you've learned one, you've already learned the other. They are identical. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus on the joint parameters here. And we're going to focus first on the three methods of placement, because the method of placement is really what's going to dictate how each of these parameters work. The method of placement is divided into three sections. We have quantity, space, and space exact. We're first going to start with quantity, which is the easiest one. Whenever you choose the method of placement quantity, it means whatever value you put here, let's say it's 1, 2, 3, that is the exact number of tie rods we're going to have on the in joint, regardless of how big the width of the joint may get. And if we choose quantity 1, it's going to ask us here to offset that tie rod from the in joint a specific amount. So what we're going to do here is say offset 2 inches, enter. When we hit 2 inches, you can see that PractiCAD's placed the tie rod 2 inches from the in joint, quantity 1. You will notice here that you do have a parameter for side offset on in as well. Here we're going to change it to 2. Now it's not affecting the center one at all. Where side offset will start to affect is if you raise the quantity to 2 or more. Notice here when we put on 2, now we've got a tie rod on either end. And the distance that tie rod is from the in joint is by offset from in. The distance the tie rod is from the side of the wall is from the parameter side offset on in. So if we make this 6 inches, we now have only 2 tie rods in quantity that are 2 inches from the in joint. Each are 6 inches from the side. You'll notice here that if we were to put one more tie rod in there, it's going to put one that splits the difference between the two. So the way it would place things from one end of the duct to the other is it place one on one end based on whatever your side offset is, another on the other end, which would have the same exact side offset as this one, and then no matter what number you pick from then on, it's just going to split the difference based on the number. So if I said quantity 4, we're going to get 4 tie rods. Regardless of how big this width may get, we're only going to get 4 tie rods. The second method we're going to cover is the method of placement called space. Basically what the space method does is it takes the entire length of the joint and it divides it up equally so that the distance between each tie rod will be exactly the same. Now that distance might vary. However, what we do when we select a method for space, PractiCAD opens up the option for spacing on in, and then we give it a value. Now the value we give here is not necessarily going to be the value between or the distance between tie rods. The value here means that we're telling PractiCAD if we say 6 inches for spacing on in, and we're in the space method of placement, we're stating that there better not be a gap between tie rods any larger than 6 inches. For every 6 inches, we must have a tie rod. However, the distance between those tie rods might vary a little bit depending on the odd value of the width of the duct. So just because we say space 6 inches, we might not necessarily get 6 inches exactly between the tie rods. For example, what we've got here on the screen is we've got the method of placement space on the right. And what we've done is we had set the value for 6 and we ran these tie rods down the line. Now you'll see what PractiCAD did was it actually took the entire length and it chopped it up so that we have equal distance between each tie rod. Even though the value we said was 6, PractiCAD uses that as the maximum distance allowed between the two tie rods. Here you can see from the edge we have 5.5 inches to the tie rod. And then in between each tie rod you can see it's marked by the dimensions lines. We have 5.5 inches. So what it did was it took the total length allowed between the two tie rods It divided it up by the maximum spacing, and it makes sure that they're equal in value. This is different from the next method we're going to cover, which is called space exact. What space exact means is that the spacing value we put here has to be the distance between the tie rods. Whatever value you put here, in this particular case we put 6, that will be the distance between tie rods in the center joint. For example, here you can see what happened was it made sure that between all the tie rods, after the ones on the end, in between the first and the last placed, when you're going across the duct, we have exactly 6 inches of space in between. This one was used with the space exact method. Now that would mean that the walls, or the distance between the walls and the tie rod, that space might be shorter. But after the first tie rod, every single tie rod here is going to have exactly 6 inches of space between them. And of course, the last one's going to have whatever the spacing was the first did. So essentially what PractiCAD does is it creates the first one, then it puts as many in between, centered into the fitting at 6 inches apart, and it adjusts the ends. With the space method, PractiCAD simply takes the total length from end to end, it chops it up into equal amounts with the value it cannot be higher than. So you won't get any spacing between the tie rods greater than 6, but you can see here we have it less than 6. Here what PractiCAD did was it decided to make exactly 5.5 inches in between each tie rod, rather than making an exact 6 inches in between the tie rods in the center and adjusting the ones on the end. So that is the difference between the space method and space exact. It is the same inside PractiCAD.